Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I do apologise if it's been a couple of weeks since I made a video. It seems to be all too common, doesn't it, me making a video twice a month instead of once a week or whatever. But as I've touched on previous videos, it zaps a lot of time, and to be honest, I'm busy with other stuff as well, so it's not like I've got all day, every week to make videos. But another kind of plus point is that by not making a video every single week, it gives me a bit of time to think about what's going to make a good topic, what are people talking about, because anyone will tell you that people who make a video every single week, there's this danger of repetition and rehashing stuff, and maybe the videos start to lose a bit of their sharpness on the topic, niche front and stuff. So it's not such a negative thing, but that's in a nutshell why I haven't made a video as frequently as I've been making them in the previous year. I'm just kind of not stepping back from it, but in a way, sort of stepping back from it a little bit and just thinking a little bit more about the types of videos that I'm making, and whether they're kind of repetition or duplication, or just trying to find what people are talking about. So without further ado, for today's video I'm going to be talking about some of the things which are keeping tech executives up at night, if I can phrase it like that. So obviously on all the other videos I've been talking about things like SEO, GEO, that's generative engine optimization, it's kind of optimizing for large language models, and ChatGPT and Perplexity and Claude and these chatbots and stuff. And some of the other videos I've made have been around videography, because I've got quite a good interest in that. I know quite a bit about it. I've been doing it for a couple of years. You never stop learning. I mean, the same with all marketers. Just as you think something new comes out, a new algorithm is launched, a new interface is launched, or a new product is launched which supersedes it. So truthfully, you never stop learning. But look, to today's video, I'm going to be talking about AI and privacy. A lot of people in the industry will tell you that there's all this regulation coming in now, and the technology is moving faster than the regulation, by the way. That's almost a given. And legislation and regulation is stalled, if you like. It's not kept pace with the pace of change and stuff. And so I've got some stuff in front of me. I'm going to be doing what I normally do, adding a bit of personal context and reading off the screen a bit. But let's dive into it. So basically, you might have heard something in the news at the moment about Meta. It's just been fined again. I think I haven't got it in front of me. I think it's on the news today, actually. I think it was Mexico. Been fined. Let me see if I can bring it up. It won't take long to find it. It'll take me 10 seconds. This was on the news at lunchtime. So I think it's Mexico. Let's just double check though. Meta fined 310 million. Blah 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 on child safety, stuff, or the rest of it. Mexico, it's a Mexican court. So $375 million. So that equates to 310 million pounds. So there's always court cases around the world, not just Meta, other platforms as well. And there's this big row going on about, how safe is social media for children of different ages, by the way. It could be teenagers, it could be 16, it could be 12, it could be 7 or 13 or whatever. But look, that's just one example. Like I say, it's moving at breakneck speed. Everyone's failing to keep pace with the change. That includes, a lot of these senior marketeers and stuff. So look, this is what I got in front of me here. So it's got what's hot, okay, in terms of the AI privacy, anxiety cluster, if I can phrase it like that. So AI surveillance in everyday life. So things like wearables, which I don't have like these wearable devices, but wearables, smart devices, travel tracking. It even spills over into the travel sector, which is something I'm hoping to pivot the channel into a little bit more. Is this AI, kind of creepy versus useful. So, you know, we all use it in everyday life, you know, either deliberately or maybe not so obviously, but you know, where does that balance lie between it being useful and creepy, if that makes sense? And you know, has that line become, or is it becoming ever increasingly blurred, which I think it is. I think a lot of people would agree. Who owns and controls the data? You know, so you know, some of these large language models now, you know, or AI programs, you know, you can kind of hit a button or a little nozzle to say that you consent to, you know, your data being used to train the AI, or that you don't. But you know, that's just coming out now. So the fact that AI has been around for a couple of years and people have been putting all their personal information into it, you know, who owns and who controls that data? Do you see what I mean? These are all question marks. So recent coverage shows rising concern that consumers are trading privacy for convenience without understanding the consequences. Look, I can relate to this. I mean, you know, I use different forms of AI. We can all relate to it, I'm sure. You know, I use like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, you know, all the rest of them, you know, for different purposes. You know, the truth of the matter is, you know, millions of us do, you know, not just in the UK but around the world. We use it for work, for businesses to, you know, polish things up, to rephrase things, to give us new ideas, and you know, that's based on the input that we put into the AI, which includes our own ideas, in some cases our own personal information. I try not to do that. I try to limit the personal information I put into AI and just keep it kind of generic, if that makes sense. So here's why it's you know, why these things are, you know, deeply troubling or concerning to people, if that's a good way to put it. So tangible examples can include things like smart glasses, recording strangers. You know, if you've ever seen smart glasses, you know, around, probably not in the remote areas of Cornwall, but if you're in the bigger cities, or if you Google it, you'll understand what they are. Things like AI assistants. So, you know, have you ever heard of Siri? You know, it's just one example, but there's others as well. And you know, maybe have it positioned in your lounge or your kitchen or your bedroom. I mean, I've spoken to people who've got these things. I don't have one in the house personally, but I know people that do. You know, they're asking it questions like, you know, Siri, tell me how to make this, or Siri, what can I do tonight, or Siri, you know, I've got this dilemma, or what should I do? Do you see what I mean? So, and it's kind of listening and recording that information, and that information is going somewhere. So, you know, also like legal frameworks lagging behind the tech innovations. So you know, this has long been a problem. I mean, when the kind of Facebook burst onto the scene, you know, back in sort of, you know, 2007, 2006, you know, something like that, maybe the notch before, you know, there wasn't all this regulation and people were free to do exactly what they wanted, and it wasn't illegal to do some of the stuff that it is today. Certainly not on social media, because the regulation has lagged consistently behind the tech and the technology boom, specifically the AI in the last few years. Yeah, it's a massive area. I mean, I thought this would be a good sort of video to make today, because, you know, instead of just talking about content and social media and, you know, how to get seen in the search results and, you know, all that kind of stuff, I thought this would make a good topic, you know, just to kind of talk about it in a, you know, rational way and highlight and flag some of the things which I'm sure many of you can relate to who are listening, watching to this video, okay? So next bit, so regulation, chaos, AI, data, and martech. So martech is obviously marketing tech, you know. This is huge in marketing, you know, it always has been, to be honest. These are the kind of tension points, if you like. So the government's trying to push for more enforcement. We see that in the UK, actually. It's happening in other countries too, you know, it won't be hard to find them. Just go to Google, type in, you'll find it. Whatever country you're watching this from, it's most likely happening there as well. So governments are pushing for more enforcement, and I think, you know, because of all the things that have happened and different court cases and, you know, some of these commercial disputes about AI. I mean, there's one in the news not so long ago about, you know, music artists who, you know, launched a court case because, you know, they felt it was unfair that the government had kind of aligned with the AI companies and allowed them to use their music to train their models, and they weren't getting paid any of the royalties. So that's just like one example, but to be honest, there's 101 others, just for coin an expression. So some of these things are commercial, some of these things are on a more of a personal level, where somebody's got their sons or their daughters using social media and they get addicted to fentanyl, or they commit suicide, or they get into pornography, or whatever it is. These softwares, platforms, AI and stuff, the regulations catching up, and yes, there's the Online Safety Act which came into force last year, and that's ever evolving, and it's going to be ever evolving, because these things shift with time and perspective, and they evolve and stuff, so yeah, expect more of it. So another thing that's happening is like businesses are facing what I describe as like fragmentation, across different regions. So just take, for example, I'm just making this up, so just say you've got a company in Scotland that makes Scottish whiskey, which I know some of those companies do exist. Now, they don't exclusively sell to the UK. A lot of them market to China, so that means they're marketing to different regions of the world. And it's the same with other companies, in the UK, maybe it could be, I'm just making this up, it could be like a skincare company that market their products to Europe, or to, or it could be like a beef producer, that exports their beef to Latin America, or to China, or, some other place on earth. So, the fact that companies do market to different regions, which is perfectly normal, by the way, they're facing this kind of fragmentation where some regions use, like take China for example, they use like WeChat and Little Red Book, and a ton of other platforms. Last year I hoped to set up a kind of a video interview which I was going to record with a woman from Germany who runs this kind of marketing agency which specializes in marketing to China, but she just had a kid or something not so long ago, and she was busy and tied up with that, and she's a bit stressed out with that, to be honest. It never really kind of came off, but yeah, maybe one day. But like, she's a person to talk to about that. She's got a lot of specialist knowledge about China and how to depending on what type of business you are and who your target market is within China, or whether it's e-commerce or a physical product or whatever it might be. There's loads of different possibilities and channels. And this is the thing, guys. These channels in these different regions, they're all regulated in different ways. So how things are regulated in China definitely won't be how things are automatically regulated in terms of social media, software and AI in the UK, because it's difficult to police the internet, right? And many of you would agree with that. What's happening is being fragmented, it's being regionalized. So, like in America, they have their own kind of frameworks and acceptability terms and stuff, which is why, when you sign into Facebook or create a Facebook account, if you create an account in Europe, it says, the terms and conditions are, exclusively under the courts, of Dublin, which is like an EU country, because that covers the EU area. And if it's outside of Europe, then it's under the courts of Los Angeles, United States of America. So these things are regionalized, and there's different terms and conditions depending on where you're using these products, how you're using them. And this is the thing that businesses are really kind of struggling with. It's fine if you're just like a UK business and you're marketing to like the UK and Ireland. I don't think you have too much of a problem with it, but businesses that need to expand, that want to scale and market to different countries, they're almost certainly going to be using different platforms, whether it's paid ads or Google ads or TikTok ads, to market to different countries. And there's different laws and different regulations about what you can do and what you can say, and how you can position your products and how you can't position your products. And this is, one thing which is kind of causing a bit of bother, regulation, AI, etc., data, how it's handled and stuff. It's a massive area. I just thought, as I said, it'd be good to make a video about this today instead of just talking about content and social media and SEO and loads of other stuff. So these are some of the things which are, I don't know if trending is the right word, but being talked about a lot, as we speak. So the EU AI Act and global equivalence kicking in. So for those of you who don't know, there's an EU AI Act. It's certainly in the making. Bit like the Online Safety Act, these things never end. There's always additions to it. As they spot a loophole, we peg something else onto it. And there's global equivalence kicking in, different countries. Just touched on that a moment ago, how depending on what country you're based in and what country your marketing is selling into, there's all different kinds of regulations. Probably too much, to be honest. So there's an explosion of AI-related legislation globally. I just saw something last night, actually, just by chance, about Sora and how OpenAI are withdrawing the product. If you Google it, you'll find it. Everyone's been using that to create these, cool, fun videos and stuff. But there's been this big push at OpenAI now to focus on business and productivity orientated AI rather than plow a load of resources into that. If you Google it, you'll find it. They're going to pull that. It just sprung up in my news feed last night. So another thing that's really hot in the media is children's data targeting. How companies target children. By the way, just for clarity, children doesn't have to mean they're 8 years old. It could be somebody who's 15, or 16, So a lot of companies are finding they're coming under increased scrutiny about how they target children with their adverts and their products and stuff. So the whole thing's becoming much more regulated, and depending on what kind of product it is and what country the company or the vendor is in and what country the people they're targeting are in, there's a whole layers of regulation. I suppose, if you're to ask why do people care about all this, a couple of different reasons really. The massive compliance costs and uncertainty. So, to make sure you're fully compliant with all of this stuff costs a lot of money. By that I'm talking way over £1,000, so the bigger the company is, especially if it's got multi-site operations, the higher those costs are. And there's this uncertainty element as well, because a company could spend a lot of money trying to be compliant, and then within a year or 2 years, a massive new piece of EU legislation or US legislation or Chinese legislation could come in, which might totally upend everything and cause that company to go back to the drawing board and to have to spend a load more money. So marketing tech stacks may become legally or technically obsolete overnight, depending on what legislation is pushed through and stuff. It's a huge area. So you probably heard of a death of third-party data if you're a marketeer. That was all the rage a few years ago. Now it's zero-party data, but so this relates to things like cookies and stuff. So a very real shift in marketing, if you like. It's happening right now. So what's hot in that? So first-party, zero-party data strategies replacing cookies. For quite a long time, there's been an ability to block these cookies, different ways of doing it. Some cookies you can block, some you can't. But certainly in your browser you can set your cookie settings to standard, medium, strict, etc. If you set it to really strict, a lot of websites will break and you won't be able to kind of log in or use them properly. But also VPNs can block certain cookies. Some cookies you can't, and a lot of websites set their essential cookies only, which you have to accept if you want to be able to use those websites. But things are changing, and it's now towards sort of consent-driven marketing. So basically it's about, as I just said, the companies have got to get a lot more consent from the people, rather than just blasting them with cookies or making them accept loads of cookies to get their data. So This has been driven by regulation and also a big consumer awareness surge. Consumers are becoming more aware of this. There's stuff on BBC News, on ITV, and all the main media like The Guardian, Telegraph, different tech publications and stuff. So the consumers, you don't necessarily have to be like a technologist or a marketeer, but consumers in general are becoming more aware of this, and it's basically breaking the last 15 years of digital advertising economics. So it's a big change for sure. Emerging narratives, so it's more about an owned audience versus like a rented audience. So by having that consent-based marketing, you sort of own the email addresses, you own the audience, in terms of what you're pushing out to them and stuff. You've got their consent, and it's about sort of data minimization now, as a strategy. In the past, count back 10-15 years, it's all about blasting people with cookies, often without their consent, and gathering, snooping different bits of information. It's still about your information, but it's more about a consent-based strategy and companies owning those email lists, email marketing lists, rather than just blasting people with emails that they haven't consented to. Okay, so from AI hype to AI accountability. Now, obviously AI is still being hyped up. I just forgot my coffee here. I better have a sip before it goes cold. Yeah, it's gone cold. Oh dear. It's certainly lukewarm. Okay, so for AI hyped AI accountability, we're entering the prove it works safely phase. So I've seen that a lot. Now when platforms launch, because of all this regulation, whether it's the media or technology trust companies and stuff, they want to check that it works, rather than just getting instead of sort of getting on runway with it, finding out there's kind of flaws and pitfalls and things they haven't thought about. Things are being tested a lot more before they're rolled out, from beta to kind of mainstream. So AI factories inside enterprises. Look, as there's different types of AI. Even Chinese AI. There's so many different sites that it's actually fatiguing to list them all, if that makes sense. It would be impossible to list them all in the description. There's just too many of them. I think one of the key shifts is for years 24, 2025 were more about experimentation, because this AI stuff has been out, probably in a big way since sort of 2023. 2026 is about sort of return on investment and risk accountability. Excuse me. When the AI first came out, especially OpenAI and all the publicity it got with ChatGPT, a lot of big investors put billions and billions of pounds into the AI, and now it's been kind of rethought a little bit to figure out the return on investment and also the risk accountability in line of the regulation, which is some of it's arrived, some more of it's coming. Because one thing getting all excited about it, throwing billions of dollars at AI, but if it's going to get hit by like a lawsuit, costing hundreds of millions of pounds, like 18 months later, or certain governments pull the plug on their citizens using that AI, or if it doesn't fit into the different models I've just talked about, the different regions and stuff, then it's a bit of a failed experiment. So now there's a lot more thought around return on investment and weighing up the kind of risk accountability side of things. It's a fascinating subject. I thought it'd be a great video to make, because some of this stuff I kind of touch on in the videos like a little bit. I thought I'd make a whole video about this today. So why do people care about that? So, but basically boards are now accountable for AI risk. So, if they just roll something out, which pretty much did happen in sort of 2023, early 2024, and it kind of fails one of these tests with regard to the different types of regulation and stuff, it's the board members who are held accountable. So procurement teams are blocking unsafe AI. So again, what's the definition of unsafe AI? Well, that's going to vary by country, by target group, by culture, you know. I mean, good example, you know, what's acceptable, I'm just making this up as I go along, you know, what's acceptable in Southeast Asia, you know, might not be acceptable here, you know, in terms of, you know, just the general culture, the general lifestyle, and vice versa, by the way. I mean, you know, a good example of that is you could, you know, make an off-the-cuff comment about the royal family in the UK, but if you did the same thing in Thailand, you'd be in jail, you know. So I'm just saying there are different cultural and regional differences, and these AI platforms, you know, whether it's China, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's America, South America, Europe, Africa, you know, they have to fit in with these different regions and these different countries' laws, cultures, so they don't kind of hit red flags and stuff. Yeah, you get the idea. Okay, so just branching off slightly, so now to travel and digital identity and border tech, because, you know, one of the things I hope or would like to do with the channel is just kind of pivot it just ever so slightly next year into slightly more of a luxury travel space and sort of travel tech and stuff like that. So I'm still going to be doing the marketing vlogs, but I'm perhaps going to be doing some, you know, travel tech stroke luxury travel space stuff alongside that, and just see how that goes, just to try and broaden the reach and broaden the interest. But just on the subject of this, so obviously this AI is now being used in things like travel, digital identity and border technology. You know, if you think of your passport, it's got a biometric chip in it, and, you know, just the other day I had to do something to get a DBS certificate, and I, you know, had to log into this one government thing, and you place your passport, you place your phone on the passport, and it kind of checks the information against what's on the app and stuff. Yeah, so it's all very, you know, sophisticated, and it's just a sign of times. You know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, this stuff never existed. It was all paper-based systems, and that's why, you know, you got all this fraud of different types, not necessarily financial fraud, but basically people trying to hoodwink a particular system. Whereas now everything's getting digital, you know, so digital wallets, you know. So let's get back to this. So things like biometric passport, facial recognition at borders. Yeah, when I lived in Gibraltar, you know, this was just before Brexit, I did 2 stints of 9 months out there. I miss it, actually. I'd love to go back, and I may do one day. But basically, the border now at Gibraltar is the physical border is going to disappear, because the UK government have done a deal where there'll be Spanish police at the airport, so the actual border won't need to exist. So it makes sense, but it did exist when I was there. And, you know, basically when I was coming in and out of Gibraltar, all I had to do is like put my passport, you know, the identity page face down, look into the camera, and it you know, and it would obviously compare my iris and all the rest of it, biometrics, with the information stored on the chip, and it let me in, you see, so I didn't have to have it stamped. But yeah, this is a classic example. I mean, every time I land at Bristol Airport, you know, literally the same thing applies. Literally put your passport face down, look into it like a camera, and the biometrics let you in. So look, there's massive changes. That's just like one example. Obviously it's a marketing video, but I think, you know, that I'm just trying to think of a way I can sort of, you know, conclude this video without making it too long. But, you know, another area, if you like, where, you know, and because regulation is coming in, is because of, you know, people have been using AI to make these deep fakes. So that's like when somebody makes a video with somebody's face, and you know, maybe they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, let's just leave it like that, and then they publish it, and it creates embarrassment or potential financial losses for, you know, for the person who's been deepfaked. So, you know, if these systems aren't robust enough, you know, it can create trust collapse, if I can phrase it like that. You know, like AI kind of influencers and stuff who generate contents and ad are under constant pressure to, you know, get stuff out as fast as possible, and they're using AI to do it, or to help them do it. But, you know, deepfake regulation is exploding globally, so, you know, it's the same as what I said before. You know, when all this stuff first came out and it wasn't regulated, same applies to Facebook, same applies to AI. You know, you could do certain things, I'm not saying particularly dodgy things, but you could do certain things. Let's just give you an example of that. Maybe you could have a photo of James Bond, with your products and stuff like that. Whereas now, you'd probably run into problems with that, to be honest. I don't want to get into anything deepfake pornographic, because that's clearly obviously wrong, but you see where I'm coming from. There's all this intellectual copyright, and AI is having to comply with that, and it's a minefield, guys. Which is why I'd encourage you, if you are one of these content creators using AI to make content for your brand, or if it's for another brand, UGC, universally generated content, you need to stop and think about this, because it could come back on you. It's a fascinating subject. There's I could go on and on about it. I think you got the gist of what I'm saying. There's tons more stuff here. I'm not going to have time to. What I'll try and do is I'll try and just compact it down and put it in the description. But literally, people are looking for, when I say people, consumers, they're looking for more authentic experiences, they're looking for trust, and whilst AI can help, optimize certain things, AI is great for things like paid ads. You can use like something like Pixis AI, and it can help you to optimize the campaigns and allocate the budgets and the bids and spend and in real time and stuff. So, AI is great for stuff like that, but when you're creating content, how many of you truthfully know where the AI has pulled that content from, whether it's 100% legal to use? Do you see where I'm coming from? It depends on the type of content you're making, and that's why there's this rush to create kind of safe AI, if I can phrase it like that. Because when these systems first launched, they were literally pulling data and recording data, often without people's consent, and that's now starting to change. So there's you can honestly, I talk about this for a couple of hours. It's just a massive area. I've almost run out of time for the video, to be honest, purely because if I make it too long, I know people won't watch and they'll click off. But what I'll try and do is I'll try and make sense of some of this stuff and type it all out and put it in the description, and maybe have a read through it yourself. Hopefully you got something from the video. It's a bit of a different video, but it's a relevant topic. So many marketing vlogs nowadays are all about how to get listed on Google, or how to get listed on ChatGPT and Perplexity and Claude and stuff. I just thought I'd discuss this topic because it's one of the biggest things that creates headaches for marketers at the moment. It's one thing having these ideas, it's one thing having the budget, but if it's falling through the cracks with AI and the regulation, it's going to cost you a lot more in the long run. So thank you very much for watching, listening, and I'll hope to see you on the next video. So take care, and I'll see you soon. Ciao, bye.